So, here's a good question for you. What's a game that you really wanted to enjoy, but no matter how hard you tried, you just couldn't? One of those games for me is Auto Modellista. This game has style. It has near Persona levels of style, man. The cel-shaded graphics, the emphasis on manga-style visual effects like shake lines, edgy tire smoke, and speed lines, the car selection and the ability to modify said cars in an arcade game setting, the visual customization including the ability to make your own vinyls pixel by pixel, a mix of hill climb tracks, city tracks, and even a real circuit in Suzuka, one of the best replay creators in a racing game, where you can effectively make something that can rival the Splash intro video for the game. An unlockable track and mode where all cars are converted into RC cars. Auto Modellista has everything I could want in a game of its type. Except for two things. A worthwhile, balanced career mode, and good racing. It's so painful that so much of Auto Modellista is so good, and it's all ruined by the racing itself. Unfortunately, that also means this review is probably going to be pretty short, which I suppose makes sense, since the game itself only takes about 3.5 hours to finish. So let's get the core structure out of the way first. Auto Modellista offers 7 categories of races to go through in a linear fashion. There is no currency in the game, meaning you can pick any car you've unlocked, which is all but around 8 of them or so from the beginning, and you can customize these cars with any parts you've unlocked. You can choose your brakes, tires, transmission, turbo, and even swap engines out to others from the same manufacturer. Cars range from tiny things like the Subaru 360 all the way to monsters like the Ford GT40. Most cars are Japanese as expected for an early 2000s Japanese racing game, but you've got a few exceptions. You can also spend time customizing your garage if you want. Once you're done doing that, you pick one of the races in the categories you've unlocked, and you race. This is where the first problem rears its head. Nearly every race lasts around 3 minutes at most, and only the last few categories offer series of races. This means you absolutely blaze through each of the categories. Well, until you get to the last few, some of which are torturously hard to finish, but we'll get to that in just a bit. Each race in the career unlocks something. Mostly it's emails with advice, random trophies, posters, and other objects to fill your garage with. But you'll also get upgrade parts and secret cars here and there. But to actually unlock everything requires doing hundreds of races, which is ludicrous considering you only have like 40 or so races to do total, and most of them are on the same 3-ish tracks. Oh, but sometimes they're reversed. How fun. The length of this career mode itself isn't the problem. After all, there's an arcade option, there used to be online play, though I don't think either of these contribute to unlocks in the career, so they can only go so far. No, the length of the game only becomes a problem because what's on offer is so substandard. The fact that most races take place on the same few tracks, and the fact that only about 2 of these tracks are more complicated than massive straights broken up by a few extremely basic corners, these things highlight just how short the campaign is, because despite that length, the races still end up getting extremely tedious and repetitive. You've seen nearly everything the game has to offer after 1 or 2 races. Even the addition of rain doesn't offer any meaningful variation. The only real highlights in theory are Suzuka and the 2 hill climb tracks. These tracks are much more complex and unique than the rest, and could offer some places to stretch your legs. But firstly, Suzuka is literally only used once for the very last race in the career. And secondly, the much bigger problem is how absolutely terrible the physics are in this game. So even when playing on the good tracks, you've got to contend with some really sluggish controller response and a physics system so slippery that comparing it to driving on an ice rink doesn't even do it justice. It's bothersome that the game has so much material for learning how to race properly as if it's a sim, and yet absolutely none of it actually applies to the game itself. It teaches you the fundamentals of taking corners, drifting, individual advice for tackling tracks, braking points, and so much more, including multiple lessons on each of these. But racing in this game more or less consists of drafting behind opponents to gain speed, and then smashing the brakes for a third of a second to take corners. Even with your transmission set for max speed, oftentimes your car will reach its max speed in around 4 seconds. Then you just get to sit there and snore as the car bounces off the governor until you get to a corner. Sometimes the difference between max acceleration and max speed for your transmission is a difference of just a few miles an hour. The slippery physics are sometimes genuinely painful too, with the most severe problems manifesting themselves in those last few career events. In particular, the final series of hill climbs can be down to dumb luck. These tracks, as stated before, are pretty complex compared to everything else. Lots of hairpin turns, banked curves, tight lanes requiring precise lines, S-curves, chicanes, massive elevation changes, and none of it works with the physics. It's impossible with a normal controller to keep your car going straight in this game, because the back end, even with the best tires, never actually has grip. It will always drift away from the direction you last turned toward, meaning to maintain a properly straight heading, you're forced to do micro fishtails all the way down the straight. And you have to be really careful so that you don't scrub off tons of speed or even spin out. Then, once you want to do a turn, it doesn't matter what car you're in, nor what speed you're at, or your tires or anything else, you'll always end up in a drift. Sometimes it can be maintained. Other times the car will inexplicably decide that it's had enough and oversteer without your input, before grinding you to a halt. And it doesn't help that the AI loves to bump you into walls and junk, which is particularly bad in those hill climb tracks, because they're so narrow and windy. And it's not just that the cars all drift like its initial D. That'd be fine if it was consistent, and if the controller response was swift. Unfortunately, controller response feels like you're playing on an early HD display that didn't include a game mode. But beyond that, the way the cars drift is often baffling. Like, why exactly does the game offer advice about the difference between front-wheel drive cars, rear-wheel drive cars, etc. if it's not going to follow that info in the least? Look at this. Compare this all-wheel drive Subaru with only 276 horsepower and racing super slick tires. In other words, a car that shouldn't slip under any circumstances outside of slamming the car back and forth at like 100 miles an hour. A car that couldn't maintain a burnout to save its life. To this rear-wheel drive Viper with almost 500 horsepower and the same tires. A car that should be much, much more slippery. Why is the Subaru much harder to handle, quicker to slip, and slower to regain grip? This is what these same cars drive like stock in Gran Turismo Sport and with super slick tires. This is the way it's supposed to be, the way it is in every sim racer, including Gran Turismos that came out around that time, and in every arcade racer, including arcade racers that came out at the time, with the same cars. This is the way it is in real life. That's why they all fit this model, even if they're going with something arcadey. It's the basics of physics for cars. I'd be fine with the fact that both cars slipped and drifted in Auto Modellista, if at least the Viper slipped more. But it doesn't. It feels confusing, backwards, and again, doesn't follow the advice the game itself gives you. Racing lines just don't matter much in this game. Braking points don't matter much in this game. Grip versus drift, which the game makes a big deal about and has multiple types of tires for, doesn't matter in this game. Max speed versus acceleration setups don't matter. Opponents are balanced around your car, meaning car choice doesn't matter. Nothing matters, because 90% of the time the game is absolute cake, and the other 10% is luck. I, someone who has put thousands of hours into sim racers and hundreds more into arcade and kart racers, could only just make enough of a difference with my skill to complete the few cheap events. And it was still after about 40 minutes of trying and getting unlucky. I've heard that you can cheat the game by picking a really slow car like the Subaru 360 and then swapping to a much stronger engine. Apparently the game balances your opponents around your base car, not around engine swaps. So doing this should mean you'll be racing a bunch of cars that can barely hit 50 miles an hour, while you should theoretically be able to do well over 100 because you're as light as them, but with much more power. By the end though, I was too upset to even try this. I was done with the game. And as I said up top, it's a shame, because this game has so much going for it. I would love to see a remake or a sequel. Imagine a game that looks like this, but in 4K. Imagine having what would essentially amount to an Initial D simulator. Games like Killer 7 upscale amazingly to 4K because they have a similar graphics style in a lot of ways. I mean, I'm sure there's an indie title or two that do exactly what I'm describing, HD Auto Modellista. But how cool would it be to see a game with a Capcom-sized budget these days like Auto Modellista? It could be amazing. I remembered being a bit annoyed with this game when I first played through it around 15 years ago. But I also clearly remembered that I was out from school sick that day, so I figured at least some of that was just due to the fact that I wasn't feeling well and probably shouldn't have been playing any games in the first place. I knew the game was short, too. I knew the controls were drifty, but I was expecting a lot more than this when going back to it. I was hoping my skill with racing games would have allowed me to recontextualize Auto Modellista. I hoped I'd find an arcade drifting paradise. What I got was a slog with flickers of brilliance. It may have only lasted one sitting and about 4-ish hours of playtime. But the actual act of playing Auto Modellista sometimes felt like slow motion torture. The only potentially redeeming factor is if it plays well with a wheel. But I don't have one for the PS2, and I'm not about to track one down anyway. So as of now, the most I can say is that this is a game that should be watched from afar, but only play it for yourself if you're desperate or can't resist the aesthetic. What do you guys think though? Have you played Auto Modellista? Did you get any enjoyment out of it? Would you play it again? Sound off in the comments below, and I'll see you guys next time.